Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests for today. First, we have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's the Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Nia Johnson, who is a Visiting Assistant Professor of Law at Duke Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us. Looking forward to our conversation today. You know, when you think about the concept of reproductive health issues, initially you're probably not thinking about it from a religious influence perspective. But when the Mississippi Solicitor General Scott Stewart had presented the Dobbs v. Jackson case into the Supreme Court, he was arguing that all state lawmakers should be able to ban abortion whenever they saw fit as it related to pregnancies. And Justice Sotomayor actually posed a specific question to him when she just simply said, you know, based on what you are saying here today, how is your interest anything but a religious view? In other words, even before the court, they came to the conclusion that this has, quote unquote, not just simply a question of life or when it begins, but really a question that is debating along religious perspectives. You know, Nia, when you hear about these type of conversations and you think about the idea of people trying to juxtapose the concept of healthcare and try to divorce that from the concept of what we may talk about in the era of religion or religious freedom, it seems as though it's at a point now where it's almost merged in a way that you cannot even separate it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think I have to start with a little bit of pushback. I think when many people think about reproductive freedom issues, they are thinking about religion because so many different people's religious views inform what they believe about folks' span of about reproductive rights. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that, you know, you may have heard the slogan, like, you know, keep men's hands off of our bodies. And I think, you know, we can also expand that to keep women's hands off of our bodies because there are a lot of women who are voting probably outside of their best interest on these topics. But it's also worth noting that because religious spaces have historically excluded women from them, we actually have an even smaller range of understanding of the types of reproductive issues that people can deal with. Part of that is because religious spaces have privileged fertility and fertility without any aid, which is why you have laws being made without IVF being considered. Because, you know, when you're in a lot of religious spaces, people just assume, well, if you spend a lot of time in prayer and you do things, quote unquote, the right way, you will be rewarded with a baby. And that's not scientifically how it works. It is not grounded in a lot of different research. And so many religious communities are taking this further. I would also like to remind everybody that for a lot of religious groups, there is a principle of evangelism, right? And so for many religious people, they believe that it is my responsibility to shape the world through my beliefs and telling other people about, you know, Jesus or what have you, whatever that may look like. And now we're seeing that in the public sphere. And so this idea that, you know, this is or is not a religious view, you know, even, you know, aligning with Justice Sotomayor's perspective, it actually, you know, it misses that conflation that for many people, their religious view is who they are. And so they're taking that with them to the ballot box. Mind you, again, I'm sure my views are very clear. This is not necessarily great policy for a host of different reasons that have to do with the span of reproductive rights and freedoms that people need just to actually have a healthy body themselves, given how perilous birth has become in the United States, specifically for women of color. But it is worth noting that, you know, to start, this is a religious issue. The question is whether we're taking this religious issue to the polls, taking it to the courthouse, and whether it should be there.
Yeah, and how reproductive issues became a religious issue is really interesting. You know, it really from up and, you know, through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, reproductive issues were really more of a healthcare and social concern, but not a political one. But the real turning point was the Michigan referendum in 1972. When they had abortion on the ballot, and who led the charge opposing it? Religious groups. Catholics, Lutherans, Dutch Reformed churches, Baptists. And it was that collection of religions that defeated that referendum by 60%. So that's where we see it first coming up as an electoral issue, but it doesn't really become a partisan issue until really the 70s. In the shadow of Watergate, there was an effort to drive Republican turnout, right? And so in the 1978 midterms, you have Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell, the titular founders of the religious right, using abortion as a wedge issue to motivate evangelical voters to the polls. So it's this collaboration of religious groups in 1972, I think, that really started the religion influence that we see today.
Andrew, you've written on a lot of these topics, and in particular, as you talk about almost the making of an American religion, it seems as though no religion now can take place or be complete without some type of issue that has a political tinge to it. And somehow reproductive health has now become part of the religious dialogue in a lot of groups. I mean, have you seen that, and how have you seen that and its impact on our own current society?
So there are two issues that are going on here. Nia, I think, nailed it at the beginning. Right? When I teach religious studies, I tell students at the beginning, there's no way you leave your faith at the door. I don't ask you to. It's not the way it works. That's not how human beings behave in the world. But that doesn't mean that my religious views, because I continue to hold them, therefore should be pushed on other people politically, legally, as it goes through. Mm-hmm. But for this one, for reproductive rights, as Andre just said, it in large measure started as a political motivation for a religious view, right? It was political from the beginning when this became at least wide in the public sphere. It wasn't just so people who had a personal religious view could express that and go to the polls. It was political operatives that tried to recruit people so that they could vote for them and their chosen candidates, and they just chose religious views that thought would motivate them. So the fact that it was politically motivated from the beginning, it should matter to us as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think you bring out a good point, Andrew. Like we're not called to leave our religion at the door when we enter into these spaces, but I think that a line's been crossed when you have judges like the one in Alabama who are then quoting the Bible, and their religious sources as legal authority as to when they come down with legal opinions, right? And I think that that's where we've gone too far. Like, of course, we all hold our beliefs, and we're going to carry those with us in the decisions that we make and how we vote at the polls, but to enforce those on other people that might not hold those same beliefs is a problem.
In a state where you are, for example, like in Michigan, on one hand, people kind of look at it as a heartland of America. You have these issues that seem to be, quote unquote, important to that group. But on the other hand, there are a lot of issues that go on in a state like Michigan as it relates to, for example, the conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews. And those are things that are now not only just, conversations, but are becoming actually what I would call tag points as it relates to how you might want to vote. And it seems like the reproduction systems and concept is also falling into that category, even in those states where many people thought that it may not have been important. And so, I find it interesting, and I'm sure you've seen some of that there as well.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to remember is that we're not monolithic, right? Even within faith traditions, there's a lot of variety as far as where people come down on, reproductive health. And then, you look at different faith traditions and they have different views on reproductive health as well. And so, yeah, these can become really controversial issues because the moment you have one group kind of defining the parameters of reproductive health on other people that might not share those same views, whether those are religious or otherwise, and then quoting sources again, that not everyone agrees with should be sources of authority, we see the conflict occurring there.
Yeah, and I was just going to add earlier that part of this is also about a lack of information as well. I mean, in many religious spaces, we've also rejected concept of sex ed, and sex ed and reproductive health also encompass a number of different things. I mean, this has been, boiled down to a conversation about abortion, right, and the right to life. And never mind the fact that, when we think about the start of, when does life begin, some of this is also about virtue signaling shared values. But it's also important to remember that, reproductive health also includes, conversations about like maternal mortality, right? Like what was the line of care we are offering to individuals who are having babies in spaces that may not necessarily be safe? This could also apply to individuals when we think about child rearing, right? It's important to note that in many of these states where we have these very restrictive abortion bans and restrictions on abortion care, they also have not expanded Medicaid. And so they aren't even providing opportunities for people to be able to raise their children while also, incurring a number of different things, on them, such as like, the care of the child, diapers, et cetera. This is STD health, right? Which really is protective against a number of different diseases. Like this is a wide span of issues. And, boiling it down to abortion, unfortunately, I think for many religious groups actually shows our ignorance. And in that and of itself is something that we should not only be cautious of, but also maybe be a little bit embarrassed of. That, when we're talking to, maybe if you're in a partner relationship or talking to your daughters or et cetera, that you don't even understand the full spectrum of risk that women and women's health experiences in this country. And yet we're trying to go to the polls and make policies on things that we're not really aware of.
Andre, you've been in a unique position as somebody who's actually run for office and been on with a party that, when you were involved, could you imagine having to have your full thought process regarding healthcare for, many different groups of individuals, gender and race and creed, and if your inability to actually espouse that in a certain way would be determining whether or not people voted for you or not? I mean, can you imagine what that would be like, or was that what it was like for you?
Yeah, so any political candidate has to gauge where they stand in the district where they run. And, they say, okay, well, where are you on the political spectrum? 0 to 10, 0 being liberal, 10 being conservative. Where are you? And then where is your district on the 0 to 10? And then do you align with the views of the district and your constituents? And, and every candidate has to go through that analysis. But to take the wider view of religion and society, Pew Research did a recent poll on this issue, and on balance, the United States still has a favorable view of the role of religious institutions in American life, politics and beyond. And more than half of the public believes that churches and religious organizations do more good than harm in society. And likewise, a large majority of U.S. adults say that religious organizations strengthen morality in society and bring people together. But on the other hand, I love to hear Andrew's perspective on this. Americans are also clear that religious institutions should stay out of politics. 2/3 of Americans say that churches and other houses of worship should not be involved in political matters.
I think one thing that confuses and muddies all of this is that the framing is often in an idea of religious freedom itself, right? So one of the main organizations backing this is the Alliance Defending Freedom, right? So as Nia was saying, if we don't understand the issues, if we don't want to, if it's symbolism, I'm a person who believes this because we believe this, and it's couched in idea of freedom, it takes a lot. Reproductive health and ethics is incredibly complicated. And when we want a very simple, neat world, it's much easier to say, well, they're against my freedoms, even though the immediate response would be, yeah, but you're trying to take away mine, right? So these complicated issues, when the rhetoric is supposed to be good and bad, you're with me or right with God or against, we aren't allowed to have those conversations, I don't think.
I'm about to let that be the last word, but you're right on point with that. We want to be in a position where you either quote unquote are with me or with God, and sometimes maybe you could actually be both. In the court case HotChalk versus Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod, we find ourselves with the Lutheran Church in Missouri, second largest denomination in the United States. They maintain this ecclesiastical stewardship over Lutheran universities across the country and offer really a high quality of education that's also noted in its church's biblical worldview. However, in 2020, one of these schools found itself in a position where it needed to be closed. And soon after, HotChalk, which was a massive education technology company that had contracted to provide assistance in Concordia, they decided to sue the church over the shutdown. When you take a look at this type of activity where now you have an entity that's basically suing a church because they came to the conclusion that they actually want to close down their academic institution, and somehow your academic institution had become such a part of the fabric of an environment or of a community that when you make this call, they decide that they, quote unquote, should have a political right, or they should even have a legal right to come after you. Jennifer, when we see this type of activity where now it looks like they're calling into question when a religious organization decides to close an institution or one of its universities or not, that they could find themselves subject to in litigation. Am I missing something here, or have we gone way off the rails at this point?
Yeah, I'm honestly trying to understand this one as well. In this instance, you have HotChalk who initiated this lawsuit for $302 million, claiming that they were defrauded. And, they're talking about the fact that the college or the university transferred assets to the church and, that, they neglected paying for services and all these other allegations. But what's really troubling here is that they're now demanding that the church hand over their internal religious deliberations as part of the lawsuit. And they're saying this information is necessary and relevant to the case. And this is troubling because these are internal religious communications, right, regarding church governance and about who the church wanted to put in place into these positions that they see as religious decisions. At this point, the court has not made them turn over these documents, but it's still ongoing, this litigation. And so, depending on how this turns out, it could have major implications for all sorts of religious entities and their internal dialogue and internal documentation.
Yeah, I'm also confused by this one. And part of it is because this is a lawsuit, right? Not it hasn't been decided yet, right? And the previous court said, no, you can't have those. It's clearly religious deliberations in a religious environment. That's not the way it works. I suspect, and I'll admit also hope, that the Supreme Court would decide the same. But Jennifer's right. This could be a major change in the way that religious organizations can function. Not just do, but the way they're allowed to function. If an explicitly religious organization makes religiously based theological doctrinal decisions, and those somehow become the purview of anyone working with them, then by default, those religious decisions can't be religious decisions, right? They can't just be based solely on theological or doctrinal considerations. And it would be a major watershed moment in our understanding of religious liberty in the U.S.
Before somebody else jumps in, let me just put this out here as part of the conversation, that when you have a religious organization or one of its, affiliate entities that start to develop a relationship with a non-religious entity to the point where they begin to start to rely upon you, it begs that whole question that we've been talking about. When you decide that you want to play outside of your arena, when you decide that you want to potentially get resources from someone else, and then they decide, now we'd like to see, more information as to who you are and who's supporting you and who are you supporting and what are you doing with the resources, it almost seems like that's the big issue. If you stay in your box, you never have this concern. But if you want to play outside, the fence, then you got to deal with some of the garbage that happens outside the fence. So, that's part of the conversation here. I wasn't sure who was jumping in, but Andre, if you had a comment on that, that seems to be where we are here.
That's right. And I always said, you stay in your lane or you stay in your box. But for religious organizations, it's a wide lane. It's a big box, right? And so, you have religious institutions that not only have churches, but they have education systems, nonprofit, community service systems. And so you have a lot of these religious-based organizations in various parts of secular society, right? And so, and Andrew's right that it's interesting that this case is not a religious discrimination case on its facts. This is a discovery issue. HotChalk was a vendor. They're suing for unpaid bills, and as part of the discovery process and litigation, HotChalk rightfully demanded financial documents, balance sheets and such. but demanding internal religious documents, communications amongst its leadership about church doctrine, and now Hotbox is trying to play in the box, right? And the Oregon trial court did side with the church. And so now we're going up to the Supremes here in Oregon, and so it's an interesting set of facts. I think that they'll test the depth and scope of protection of the First Amendment, but also the expansiveness of the religious exception doctrine.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I think this point again of like once you start playing outside of your lane, what are the costs and benefits of both? I think that's a really important issue here because again, this is an issue of discovery, and this is also an issue of people, trying to understand like how they are being paid, like understanding potentially like when did the university know they were going to close? These are things that not only just affect like religious universities, this can affect any university.
Yep.
And making sure that people are actually like vendors are receiving their payments on time. And I think, looking forward, this may be something for religious universities to consider. Going back to earlier points about evangelism, quiet as it's kept, the goal of many religious institutions are to teach and change people, right? And so we consider this to be a branch off of a religious organization. But this may, add to the conversation, and maybe we're thinking about, what would it look like to actually start separating those entities, right? Where you're not actually debating how your university should function within religious spaces if you want your religious documents to stay private. Because the university is a business, a college is a business, and you cannot run on your own. You may have been able to do that before. I think many colleges were, started as like a room on a field in a campus somewhere, right? And now they've evolved into these multi-billion-dollar conglomerates that are like buying up real estate, buying up communities, like wanting to expand into healthcare, wanting to expand into other places. And so you can't, for this lack of a better word, you can't play manifest destiny with your university and not want to release your documents. And so it may be worth, religious universities thinking about maybe we should not be debating the quality of our universities and hiring and all these things in major religious meetings or major religious settings if you would like to still protect yourself.
We know, Jennifer, many of us have been involved in the discovery process, and part of the whole purpose of discovery is also finding out what makes your opponent tick. How did they come to this conclusion? Why are we here? And to really understand the doctrines and to understand your internal viewpoints may be the only way that I can understand how to really defend my client properly. So on one hand, I kind of get it. But on the other hand, I understand that when you're in the legal arena, me trying to figure out what's making you tick seems to be part of the process.
Yeah, there may be reasons that HotChalk wants this information. They might be able to claim that there's relevance in them getting these documents. But again, we have to come back to the law, right? And the fact that we have these First Amendment protections, especially to help these religious groups not have the state or others interfere into their deliberations or second guess those deliberations. And this is really important, not just for mainstream, Protestant Christianity, but also for minority religions. We don't want others interfering and looking into the process of how they make deliberations, especially those that are of a religious nature. Now, one thing I thought that Nia said that stuck with me is the fact that, are we a business? Are these schools businesses or are they ministries or are they both, right? And when we're getting into the space of them being both, then how much should you have to share when you're doing both ministry and business at the same time?
Well, I think that's part of the issue because on one hand, you have the quote unquote religious organization that should be quote unquote protected and all of its thoughts are sacrosanct in terms of what goes on from internal standpoint, but you're a hybrid entity in which you are also quote unquote this business operation. You can't be a multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar operation and claim that we're just over here playing religion. We're actually doing a little bit more than playing religion at that point. So how you end up bifurcating that, I understand is the issue, but I guess the question is it more important to protect the religious integrity of an organization, and that should always be paramount? And then what goes on from a business standpoint just simply becomes secondary. And is that a reasonable interpretation of the law? I'm not sure. When you think about the First Amendment and things of that nature, Andrew, from your perspective, what do you think on that?
I think a lot of this comes down to, we've had these issues continuously because a lot of these Christian universities specifically, right? I teach at a state university, but I'm an alumnus from a Christian university. And I remember the discussions. This happens both ways in terms of people outside of the religious organization saying, well, no, you're a university, so you play by the same rules. But also those within the denomination or sect saying, no, you can't do this, right? A doctrinal issue. And they say, well, we're not the church, we're a university. It's really difficult to have it both ways. And there has to be some delineation, intentional and I think explicit delineation of when and how you're doing those two things at the same time. For this case, in the discovery aspect, it seems that, at least according to what their lawyers have said, one of their big concerns is the selection of the university president, a lot of the leadership that are based on religious, theological, doctrinal issues. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I'm perhaps the only non-lawyer on the show. You may know better. I don't know what the decision would be in court. What exactly is it going to be? Well, because of the doctrine, you say this, and they were authoritative. I don't know what exactly we would be doing at that point.
As a denominational lawyer, it's always interesting what we're willing to share and what we're not. And I file government filings all the time and openly share our working policy and our doctrinal statements. But when it comes to specific how we make the sausage, how we do business, they don't need to know. They don't need to see board executive committee minutes or board memberships and when people were ordained and the process of ordination. So really, Andrew's point is right. It's like, where is the line drawn? And we draw that line all the time.
And I think the fact of the matter is churches are a lot like restaurants. People who eat at restaurants, generally have never worked in the kitchen of a restaurant. And if you worked in the kitchen of a restaurant, you may never eat at a restaurant. So some of this information you want to make sure it's not getting out there. So, but thanks a lot for that great conversation. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that the deadliest job in America statistically is President of the United States? 4 have been assassinated, 4 have died in office, roughly 17% chance to die if you become President of the United States.
Wow, glad I'm not thinking about that. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Thomas Dobbs of the Dobbs case and the director of public health in the state of Mississippi during the litigation, retired in 2022 and now serves as dean of the School of Population Health at the University of Mississippi.
Wow, how ironic. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure, you may not know that pastor burnout is on the rise. Currently, about 1/3 of pastors and clergy have considered leaving the ministry in the last year.
Another occupation I'm not thinking about. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So, as we're coming to an election season, I think it's worth really thinking about income inequality. And according to a new poll from the Kaiser Family Foundation, they found that 1 in 5 Americans are struggling to pay their bills right now. So it's worth thinking a little bit more about equality and how we facilitate wealth to all populations.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that great dialogue today. I learned so much, and hopefully we'll talk about this again soon. And thank you for being here with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.